18 minutes. That's all it took for 146 people, mostly teenage immigrant girls, to be wiped from existence. On March 25, 1911, as quitting time approached at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, their biggest concern was the weekend ahead. But a spark in a bin of scrap fabric changed everything. The fire spread with terrifying speed, but it wasn't the flames that sealed their fate. It was a single locked door, a door locked by their bosses to prevent theft. When they ran to escape, they found themselves trapped. The story of the Triangle Fire isn't just about a fire. It's about a death trap built by negligence. It's a story that would expose the dark underside of the American dream and force a nation to confront the true cost of its industrial might. To understand the fire, you have to understand the world that built the Triangle Factory. The early 20th century was an age of explosive growth and brutal contradiction in America. New York City had become the undisputed capital of the garment industry, churning out 70% of the nation's women's wear. This empire was built on the bent backs of a vast, cheap labor force. Hundreds of thousands of recent immigrants, desperate for a foothold in their new country. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, owned by Max Blank and Isaac Harris, the so-called Shirtwaist Kings, was a prime example of this system. Their factory occupied the top 3 floors, the 8th, 9th, and 10th, of the modern Ash Building just off Washington Square. From the outside, it looked like a fortress of progress, fireproof and solid. Inside, it was a carefully designed trap. Over 500 workers, mostly young women between 16 and 23, were crammed together, elbow to elbow, at endless rows of sewing machines. They worked grueling schedules, often 12 to 14 hours a day, for wages as low as $7 a week, a sum that would be insultingly low even by the standards of the time. The owners docked their pay for the needles they used, the electricity that powered their machines, and even for the chairs they sat on. The air was perpetually filled with lint and fabric dust, so thick you could taste it. Scraps of flammable cotton and tissue paper piled up in bins and under tables, sometimes for months at a time. The owners had a deep-seated paranoia about their workers. They feared theft, so they kept the main doors on the 9th floor locked during the working hours, forcing the women to exit through a single narrow doorway where their bags could be inspected. They feared unionization even more. Just a year earlier, in the winter of 1909, the city had been rocked by the Uprising of the 20,000, a massive strike of shirtwaist makers demanding better pay, shorter hours, and safer conditions. While many factories eventually gave in to the union's demands, Blank and Harris refused. They held out, hiring thugs to beat up striking girls on the picket line and bribing police to look the other way. They were proud of breaking the strike, of keeping their factory a non-union shop. To them, safety measures and fire drills were an unnecessary expense, a concession to workers they viewed not as people, but as parts of a machine. This wasn't just negligence, it was a business model, a model that valued a yard of fabric more than a human life. The fire began just as the workday was ending, around 4:40 p.m. It started on the 8th floor in a scrap bin under a cutter's table. The exact cause was never determined, though many believed it was a cigarette. In the lint-filled air, the tiny spark became a monster in seconds. A bookkeeper on the 8th floor saw the first wisp of smoke, then a flicker of flame. He grabbed a few buckets of water, the only firefighting equipment available, but it was like trying to put out a volcano with a teaspoon. The fire leaped from the scrap bin to the paper patterns hanging overhead, then raced across the rows of sewing machine tables, feasting on the thousands of pounds of cotton shirtwaists. The panic was instantaneous. On the 8th floor, workers scrambled for the exits. Some made it to the elevators operated by the heroic Joseph Zito and Gaspar Mortiaro, who would make trip after trip until the flames forced them to stop. Others ran for the stairways, but on the 9th floor, the workers' nightmare truly began. They had no warning, no fire alarm, only the sight of smoke and flames curling up from the floor below. When they ran to the main door to the Washington Place stairs, they found it locked. A manager with the key had reportedly fled to save himself. Desperate, they surged toward the other stairway, but the path was quickly choked by the fire. Their last hope was a flimsy, poorly designed fire escape at the back of the building. Dozens of terrified girls poured onto it. It had been built to hold only a few people at a time, and the weight of the crowd caused it to wrench away from the brick wall, twisting and collapsing. It sent more than 20 people plunging nearly 100 feet to their deaths in the courtyard below. On the 10th floor, where the executives and office staff worked, the owners themselves, Blank and Harris, were alerted. They, along with dozens of others, escaped by climbing onto the roof, where students from the adjacent New York University building helped them cross to safety. But they left the workers on the 9th floor trapped below with no warning and no way out. For those left on the 9th floor, the choice was unbearable: burn alive or jump. On the street below, a crowd of onlookers had gathered, their Saturday afternoon strolls transformed into a scene of unspeakable horror. They watched helplessly as girl after girl appeared at the window, their silhouettes against the roaring flames. They paused for a moment, then jumped, their hair and clothes ablaze. Some held hands. The fire department arrived quickly, but their ladders reached only the 6th floor, a grim 30 feet short of where they were needed most. The life nets they had strung up were torn apart by the force of bodies falling from such heights. Frances Perkins, a social worker who would later become Franklin D. Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor, was drinking tea nearby. She rushed to the scene and witnessed the horror firsthand. They were pounding the pavement, she later recalled. The thud of bodies is something I will never forget. The fire was extinguished in just 18 minutes, but in that short time, 146 lives were lost. According to official tallies, 49 people burned to death, 36 fell down the elevator shaft, and 58 died on the sidewalk after jumping. The youngest victims were Kate Leone and Rosaria Maltese. Both were 14 years old. The aftermath was a scene of apocalyptic grief. For days, a steady stream of heartbroken family members filed through a makeshift morgue set up on a city pier, desperately trying to identify the charred and broken remains of their daughters, sisters, and wives. One father identified his daughter only by her stocking. The city was engulfed in a wave of sorrow and rage. 250,000 people marched in a silent funeral procession through the rain-soaked streets, a solemn protest against the conditions that had led to the massacre. The public demanded justice, and the Shirtwaist Kings, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, were put on trial for manslaughter. The prosecution's case seemed open and shut. Over 100 witnesses testified against them. Survivors recounted in heartbreaking detail the story of the locked door. Yet the owners had hired one of the city's most brilliant and ruthless defense attorneys, Max Steyer. He systematically dismantled the witnesses' testimony, confusing the young, traumatized, Yiddish-speaking immigrant girls on the stand. He argued that they were merely repeating a story they had been coached to tell by the union. His final devastating argument was simple. The prosecution couldn't prove that the owners knew the door was locked at the exact moment the fire broke out. It was a cynical, hair-splitting defense, and it worked. After less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury acquitted them of all charges. The verdict was met with widespread outrage. It was a blatant demonstration of a justice system that favored the wealthy and powerful over the poor and voiceless. The injustice was compounded when just 2 years later, Blank and Harris's insurance company paid them about $60,000 for their losses, an average of more than $400 for each life lost. They, in turn, settled the civil suits filed by the victims' families for a pathetic $75 per life. In a final act of grotesque irony, in 1913, Max Blank was once again arrested. The charge? Chaining a factory door shut during working hours. He was fined $20. But the story of the Triangle Fire is not just a story of tragedy and injustice. It is also a story of profound and lasting change. The fire shocked the conscience of the city and the nation. It laid bare the horrific reality of the sweatshop system in a way that no strike or protest ever could. In the wake of the acquittals, the public's fury was channeled into a powerful movement for reform. The state of New York established the Factory Investigating Commission, a groundbreaking body led by two young, ambitious politicians named Robert F. Wagner and Al Smith, who would both go on to become towering figures in American politics. Over the next 2 years, the commission conducted a sweeping investigation into factory conditions across the state. They were guided by Frances Perkins, the social worker who had witnessed the fire. She took the politicians into the heart of the city's factories and tenements, showing them the dark, unsafe, and unsanitary conditions firsthand. The results were revolutionary. The commission's work led directly to the passage of 36 new laws in New York, completely rewriting the state's labor code. These laws mandated automatic sprinklers in high-rise buildings, required fire drills, made factory doors swing outward and remain unlocked, and established new standards for sanitation, ventilation, and workplace safety. They set limits on the hours women and children could work and created a new state Department of Labor to enforce the rules. This New York model became a blueprint for the rest of an industrializing America. The reforms championed by Wagner, Smith, and Perkins in Albany became the cornerstones of the New Deal on a national level a generation later. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which established the 40-hour work week and the national minimum wage, can trace its lineage directly back to the ashes of the Triangle Factory. The fire also galvanized the labor movement, particularly the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, ILGWU, which grew into one of the most powerful and progressive unions in the country. The tragedy gave them a moral authority that owners could no longer ignore. The memory of the 146 victims became a rallying cry for workers' rights that echoed for decades. More than a century has passed since that terrible Saturday afternoon. The Ash Building still stands. It's now part of New York University and is known as the Brown Building, a National Historic Landmark. For many years, there was no official memorial, only the stories passed down through generations. But the legacy of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire is not written in stone or bronze, but in the protections and rights that millions of workers now take for granted. It's in the exit sign above your office door, the sprinkler head in the ceiling, and the laws that say you cannot be locked inside your workplace. The fire was a brutal lesson, paid for with the lives of 146 young immigrants who had come to America seeking a dream. Their deaths revealed a terrible truth, that progress without compassion is meaningless, and that a nation's greatness is not measured by the wealth of its richest citizens, but by how it protects its most vulnerable. It's a lesson we are still learning today, as tragedies in factories in places like Bangladesh and Vietnam remind us that the fight for safe and dignified work is far from over. The story of the Triangle Fire endures as a powerful, haunting reminder that the struggle for justice is woven into the very fabric of our history, and that the voices of those lost in the smoke can still be heard, urging us never ever to forget. In the heart of Manhattan, just off Washington Square, a building still stands. To the students of New York University who walk its halls today, it is simply the Brown Building, a place of learning and quiet study. But a little over a century ago, it was known as the Ash Building, and it was a marvel of modern industry. 10 stories high, built of steel and stone, it was advertised as fireproof, a fortress of commerce in a city obsessed with progress. But on the top 3 floors of this supposedly indestructible building, a different kind of obsession festered. An obsession with profit that held the lives of hundreds of young women in its grip. On the afternoon of March 25, 1911, this obsession would turn the modern factory into a medieval torture chamber. The story of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire is often told as a sudden, horrific accident, a bolt of lightning from a clear sky. But it was not. It was the final, predictable scream of a system that had been groaning under the pressure of its own cruelty for years. This wasn't a random tragedy. It was an appointment with death, meticulously scheduled by greed and indifference. To understand what happened when the first spark ignited on that Saturday afternoon, we must first understand the world that built the trap, the glittering, rotten world of the Gilded Age, the desperate hopes of the immigrants who fueled its engines, and the bitter fight for dignity that preceded the flames. To walk through New York City at the turn of the 20th century was to walk through 2 different worlds occupying the same space. One was a world of unimaginable opulence, a fairy tale kingdom conjured from steel, railroads, and Wall Street gold. This was the New York of the robber barons, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts. Their lives were a spectacle of excess. Along Fifth Avenue, they erected magnificent marble palaces meant to rival the chateaus of European royalty. Inside, they hosted legendary balls where the champagne flowed like water, and the guest lists were a roll call of America's new aristocracy. At one infamous dinner, the host, a wealthy horse breeder, seated his friends' horses around a banquet table where they were served oats from silver platters. This was the glittering surface of the Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain to describe a society that was golden on the outside, but festering with decay underneath. Just a few miles south of these Fifth Avenue palaces lay the other New York. This was the Lower East Side, the most densely populated place on the face of the earth. Here, in a sprawling labyrinth of dark, airless tenement buildings, more than 500,000 people were crammed into a single square mile. To step into this world was to be assaulted by a symphony of human existence. The cacophony of a dozen different languages shouted from windows, the clatter of pushcarts over cobblestone streets, the cries of vendors hawking everything from pickles to secondhand clothes, and permeating it all, the smell of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and poverty. These were the homes of the city's industrial army, the immigrants who had fled persecution and starvation in the old world, only to find a new kind of struggle in the new. A typical tenement family of 6 or 7 might live in 2 small rooms, with no running water and little natural light. Often the only toilet was a shared outhouse in the rear courtyard, which was frequently overflowing. In the summer heat, the stench was unbearable. In the winter, the cold was a constant threat, with families huddled around a single coal stove. Disease ran rampant. Tuberculosis, known as the White Plague, was a common killer. During a heat wave in 1896, hundreds of infants died in a single week. This was the brutal reality hidden behind the golden facade of the Gilded Age. This stark division between the impossibly rich and the desperately poor was not seen as a societal failure. It was justified by the prevailing philosophies of the day. The doctrine of laissez-faire capitalism insisted that government should keep its hands off business entirely. Any attempt to regulate wages, hours, or working conditions was seen as an unnatural interference with the free market. This idea was bolstered by a twisted interpretation of Charles Darwin's new theory of evolution, social Darwinism. Thinkers like Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner argued that in society, just as in nature, there was a struggle for existence, in which the fittest would naturally rise to the top. The wealthy, therefore, were not lucky or privileged. They were biologically superior. The poor were not victims of circumstance. They were simply unfit. By this cold logic, helping the poor was not just pointless, it was a violation of natural law, an act that would only prolong the existence of the weak and hold back human progress. It was a philosophy that gave a moral and scientific justification for ruthless exploitation. It allowed a factory owner to look at the exhausted faces of the young girls working for him and see not human beings deserving of compassion, but an inferior class whose suffering was simply the price of progress. It was this mindset that allowed a city to erect fireproof buildings without bothering to legislate for a single fire drill or an unlocked door. It created a world where the profits of the few were built on the calculated acceptable risk of the many. The great engine of New York's industrial might was fueled by a single inexhaustible resource: people. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 20 million immigrants poured into the United States, and for the vast majority, the gateway to America was Ellis Island. Two groups in particular formed the backbone of the city's burgeoning garment industry and would later make up nearly the entire workforce of the Triangle Factory: Jews from the Russian Empire and Italians from the impoverished South. They came for different reasons, but they shared a common dream of a life free from the persecution and poverty that had defined their existence. For the Jews of Eastern Europe, life in the Pale of Settlement, a vast territory in Western Russia where they were forced to live, was a nightmare of oppression. They were forbidden from owning land, restricted from certain professions, and subjected to crushing poverty. Worse than the economic hardship was the constant threat of violence. The Tsarist government actively encouraged anti-Semitism, blaming Jews for the country's problems. This state-sponsored hatred periodically erupted in horrific explosions of violence called pogroms. Mobs, often incited by local authorities and the clergy, would descend on Jewish towns or shtetls, looting and burning homes and murdering men, women, and children with impunity. For millions, the choice became brutally simple: immigrate or perish. They scraped together what little money they had, sold their belongings, and embarked on the arduous journey across Europe to a port city where they would book passage and steerage. Steerage was the lowest class on the steamships, a dark, crowded, and unsanitary hold where hundreds of people were packed together for a journey that could last weeks. When they finally saw the Statue of Liberty, it was a moment of profound hope, but their ordeal was not over. At Ellis Island, they faced the cold scrutiny of medical inspectors. Families could be torn apart in an instant by a diagnosis of trachoma, an eye infection, or favus, a scalp condition, which meant immediate deportation. The Italians who came to America were fleeing a different kind of despair. Most came from the Mezzogiorno, the southern regions of Italy and Sicily. While Italy had recently been unified into a single country, the government in Rome neglected the South, taxing its people into oblivion while offering little in return. Generations of deforestation had ruined the farmland, and what little remained was owned by absentee landlords. For the peasant farmers or contadini, life was a relentless cycle of backbreaking labor for starvation wages. They were not fleeing pogroms, but a slow, grinding poverty that offered no hope for their children. Many Italian men came as birds of passage, intending to work in America for a few years, save money, and return home to buy a small plot of land. They often relied on a network of labor brokers called padroni who would pay for their passage and find them jobs in exchange for a cut of their meager wages, a system ripe for exploitation. Upon arrival, both groups gravitated to the Lower East Side, recreating their old world villages on the streets of Manhattan. They established their own neighborhoods, a Little Italy next to a Jewish quarter, with their own newspapers, theaters, social clubs, and houses of worship. But this sense of community could not shield them from the harsh economic realities of their new home. Lacking English skills and facing widespread prejudice, they were relegated to the lowest rungs of the economic ladder. The men found work digging canals, laying railroad tracks, or on construction sites. For the women, there was one overwhelming source of employment: the needle trades. The garment industry was a perfect fit for a desperate immigrant workforce. It required little training, and factory owners could pay starvation wages because there was always a fresh boatload of workers ready to take the place of anyone who complained. It was in these factories, hunched over sewing machines for 12 hours a day, that the dreams of the promised land collided with the brutal reality of the sweatshop. At the pinnacle of this exploitative system sat Max Planck and Isaac Harris, the undisputed shirtwaist kings. Their story, in many ways, was the immigrant dream personified, a fact that makes their subsequent actions all the more chilling. Both were Jewish immigrants from Russia who had arrived in America with nothing, and through ambition and relentless drive, had built a manufacturing empire. They weren't distant aristocratic capitalists like the Vanderbilts. They had come from the very same world as the people they employed. They understood the desperation of the immigrant worker because they had lived it. But that shared experience did not breed empathy. It bred a ruthless understanding of how to exploit that desperation for maximum profit. Their fortune was built on a single, iconic garment, the shirtwaist. Before the turn of the century, women's fashion was dominated by heavy, ornate, custom-made dresses. The shirtwaist was revolutionary. A ready-to-wear blouse, styled after a man's shirt but tailored for a woman, it was the uniform of the new woman of the early 20th century. It was practical, stylish, and affordable, a symbol of newfound female independence for the secretaries, telephone operators, and students entering the workforce and public life. Blank and Harris didn't invent the shirtwaist, but they perfected its mass production. By 1910, their Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was one of the largest in the country, earning them a personal profit of $400,000 a year, the equivalent of over $12 million today. Their kingdom occupied the top 3 floors of the Ash Building. The 8th floor housed the cutters, highly skilled men who laid out patterns on vast tables and sliced through dozens of layers of fabric at once. The 9th floor was the heart of the operation, a massive cavernous room packed with over 250 sewing machine operators. The 10th floor held the executive offices, inspection, packing, and shipping departments. To an outsider, it was a model of modern efficiency. To the workers, it was a prison. The sewing machines were packed so tightly together that the aisles between them were barely wide enough for one person to pass. Chairs and stools clogged what little open space remained. The owners had a policy of locking the main exit on the 9th floor on Washington Place during working hours. Their rationale was twofold. First, they claimed it was to prevent workers from stealing scraps of fabric or shirtwaists. Second, it forced every worker to leave through a single, narrow doorway on Green Street, where a watchman inspected their handbags one by one as they left, a time-consuming and humiliating daily ritual. The fire risk was astronomical, and Blank and Harris knew it. The very materials of their trade, the light cotton fabrics, the flimsy tissue paper used for patterns, the oil that dripped from the sewing machines, were incredibly flammable. For 2 months prior to the fire, piles of fabric scraps weighing thousands of pounds had been allowed to accumulate under the tables and in large bins. The floors were soaked with oil. There were no automatic sprinklers. The building's architect had opted against installing them to save money. There were a few water buckets scattered around, but no fire hoses. There were no organized fire drills. No one had ever told the workers what to do in an emergency. The building had 2 stairways and 4 elevators, but the escape routes were dangerously compromised. One of the stairways was often kept locked. The elevators, while functional, could only hold about a dozen people at a time. The final fatal flaw was the fire escape. There was only one, accessible from the rear windows. It was a narrow, flimsy metal structure, poorly anchored to the building's facade, that ended abruptly in a skylight in an enclosed courtyard 2 stories above the ground. It was never designed for mass evacuation. It was merely built to satisfy a loophole in the city's inadequate building code. This wasn't just an oversight, it was a known hazard. The factory had a history of smaller fires in 1902 and 1910, which had been quickly extinguished. Insurance inspectors had repeatedly warned Blank and Harris about the dangerous conditions, but the owners, ever focused on the bottom line, ignored the warnings. They had fire insurance, after all. In their cynical calculus, the cost of a potential tragedy was a risk worth taking. The tension inside the Triangle factory was not just about safety, it was about dignity. By the fall of 1909, the anger that had been simmering for years among the city's garment workers was about to boil over. The workers were exhausted by the long hours, the meager pay, the constant fines for being late or making a mistake, and the humiliating searches. Above all, they were tired of being treated as disposable. The desire for a union, for a collective voice that could challenge the absolute power of the bosses, was growing stronger by the day. In September 1909, workers at the Triangle factory and a handful of other shops decided to strike. The response from Blank and Harris was swift and brutal. They simply fired the striking workers and hired replacements. When the strikers formed picket lines, the owners hired private security thugs and local gangsters to intimidate and assault them. The police, often on the factory owner's payroll, turned a blind eye or arrested the picketers on trumped-up charges of assault. Day after day, young women on the picket line were beaten, dragged away, and thrown in jail. The turning point came on the evening of November 22, 1909, at a mass meeting held at the Cooper Union's Great Hall. Thousands of garment workers packed the auditorium to hear labor leaders, including Samuel Gompers, the president of the American Federation of Labor, speak about the ongoing strikes. For 2 hours, the crowd listened to a series of cautious, uninspiring speeches from the mostly male union leadership. Frustration mounted in the hall. Finally, a slight 23-year-old woman with fiery eyes made her way to the stage. Her name was Clara Lemlich. She was a Ukrainian immigrant, a seasoned strike organizer, and an employee of the Lyserson factory, another notorious sweatshop. She had been beaten by thugs on the picket line, suffering several broken ribs, but she refused to be silenced. Addressing the chairman in Yiddish, she delivered what would become one of the most famous speeches in American labor history. "I have listened to all the speakers," she began, her voice ringing with passion. "I have no further patience for talk. I am a working girl, one of those who are on strike against intolerable conditions. I am tired of listening to speakers who talk in general terms. What we are here for is to decide whether we shall or shall not strike. I offer a motion that a general strike be declared now." The hall erupted. The crowd surged to its feet, cheering and waving their hats. The chairman, sensing the shift in the room, called for a vote. Clara Limlick was asked to come forward and recite the traditional Jewish oath. "If I turn traitor to the cause, I now pledge, may this hand wither from the arm I now raise." Thousands of hands shot into the air as the crowd repeated the oath in unison. The uprising of the 20,000 had begun. The next morning, the city was stunned. Over 20,000 shirtwaist makers, most of them teenage girls, had walked off the job. It was the largest strike by women in American history to that point. For 13 weeks, through a bitterly cold winter, they marched on picket lines, holding signs in Yiddish, Italian, and English. The strike captured the public's imagination. It also gained crucial support from a group of wealthy progressive women from the city's high society, including Ann Morgan, daughter of the banking tycoon J.P. Morgan and Alva Vanderbilt Belmont. This Mink Brigade, as they were dubbed by the press, used their influence and money to provide bail for arrested strikers and to draw media attention to the cause, shaming the police for their brutal treatment of the young women. Faced with this immense public pressure and the crippling halt in production, most of the smaller factory owners eventually caved. They agreed to a 52-hour work week, a pay raise, and, most importantly, they recognized the union. But a handful of the largest manufacturers, led by the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, stubbornly refused. Blank & Harris would not under any circumstances agree to a closed shop, which would require them to hire only union members. To them, recognizing the union was an existential threat, a surrender of their absolute control over their workforce. They held out, and by February 1910, the strike, weakened by the winter and lack of funds, finally collapsed. The Triangle workers went back to their machines defeated, with no union and no meaningful improvements to their working conditions. The owners had won. They had crushed the uprising. The humiliating searches continued. The demands for improved safety were ignored, and the door on the 9th floor remained locked. But their victory was a hollow one. They had broken the strike, but they had created a factory filled with bitterness, resentment, and a profound sense of injustice. The stage was now set for a far greater tragedy. As the workers settled back into their grueling routine in the spring of 1910, the clock began its final inexorable countdown to the afternoon of March 25th, 1911. And so, the great strike ended not with a victory, but with a bitter defeat for the workers of the Triangle Factory. Blank & Harris, having successfully weathered the storm, saw no reason to change their profitable methods. The year 1910 passed into 1911 with the old rhythms of exploitation firmly reestablished. Every morning the girls filed in, and every evening they filed out through the single checkpoint, their bags searched. The scrap bins continued to overflow, the flimsy fire escape remained uninspected, and the door on the 9th floor remained a constant silent threat. The owners' victory had made them arrogant, while the workers' defeat had left them vulnerable. All the elements for a catastrophe were in place. The fuel, the lack of preparation, the locked exits, and a workforce conditioned to believe their lives were worth less than a bolt of cloth. The stage was set, waiting only for a single careless spark to raise the curtain on a tragedy. Saturday, March 25th, 1911 had dawned as a crisp, clear spring day in New York City. For the 500 workers at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, it was the end of another grueling week. Since 8 a.m., They had been hunched over their machines, the deafening roar of the motors a constant companion, their fingers flying to keep pace with the relentless demand for product. But now, as the long shadows of late afternoon stretched across Washington Square, the end was in sight. The final bell was scheduled to ring at 4:45 p.m., releasing them into the promise of a Saturday evening. They were thinking of the small pleasures that made their hard lives bearable: a walk with a sweetheart, a Nickelodeon show, perhaps a dance at a neighborhood hall. Payday was here, and in their pockets were the few dollars they had earned to help support their families. They were exhausted, but hopeful. They were daughters, sisters, and sweethearts. They were the vibrant, beating heart of immigrant New York. And in a matter of minutes, for 146 of them, that heart would stop. The fire began as all great disasters do, small and unnoticed. It was approximately 4:40 p.m. on the 8th floor in the northeast corner of the building. This was the domain of the cutters, skilled men who worked at enormous tables, some over 75 feet long, slicing through stacks of delicate, flammable cotton lawn and tissue paper patterns. Underneath one of these tables, in a large wooden bin overflowing with 2 months' worth of accumulated fabric scraps, a spark found a home. The official cause was never definitively proven, but the most widely accepted theory points to a carelessly discarded match or cigarette. Smoking was officially forbidden in the factory, but it was a rule universally ignored. In the high-pressure, monotonous environment of the sweatshop, a secret cigarette was one of the few available comforts. Someone, perhaps a cutter eager to finish his last task, may have tossed a still glowing butt into the scrap bin, assuming it would extinguish itself. It did not. In the oxygen-rich environment of loose cotton fibers and dry paper, the ember smoldered for a moment, then caught. A foreman, Frank Lonto, was one of the first to see it, a tiny wisp of smoke curling up from the bin. There was no sense of panic at first, just annoyance. Small fires were not unheard of. A manager shouted for the fire pails. These buckets, filled with stagnant water, were the factory's only firefighting equipment. A line of men formed, tossing pail after pail onto the growing flames, but it was like trying to extinguish a bonfire with a teacup. The fire, feeding on the hundreds of pounds of scraps, simply hissed and grew stronger, greedier. What happened next was terrifyingly swift. The flames, now too large for the bins, leaped upwards, climbing the wooden partitions of the cutting table like a ladder. They reached the thin paper patterns that hung from wires strung across the ceiling. In an instant, the fire went from a two-dimensional problem on the floor to a three-dimensional inferno in the air. Burning pieces of paper rained down across the room, igniting other scrap bins and the bolts of fabric stacked on shelves. The fire spread horizontally along the wires, faster than a man could run. Within 3 minutes of that first wisp of smoke, the entire eastern end of the 8th floor was a roaring wall of flame, fueled by the oil-soaked wooden floors and the thousands of shirtwaists hanging on lines, ready for transport to the 10th floor for finishing. The air turned black with thick, choking smoke. The Saturday afternoon hum of machinery was replaced by a new sound, the roar of the fire and the first screams of terror. For the 250 workers on the 8th floor, the situation devolved into chaos in a heartbeat. The fire spread with such explosive speed that it cut off access to the Green Street stairway for those working at the eastern end of the room. Their only path to safety was west, toward the Washington Place stairs and the elevators. Panic erupted. People jumped onto the cutting tables to escape the flames on the floor, shouting and screaming as they scrambled over each other. Amid the terror, however, there was also incredible bravery. The factory's bookkeeper, Dinah Lifshitz, kept her head, leading a group of women toward the Washington Place exit. Others followed, a human wave surging toward the promise of safety. At the same time, a desperate call was made to the 10th floor to warn the executives, a call that would save them but doom so many others. A call was also made to the 9th floor, but it's unclear if it was ever answered or heard above the noise of the sewing machines. The true heroes of the 8th floor were two elevator operators, Joseph Zito and Gaspar Mortillaro. As the fire alarm bell finally began to ring, a sound many workers initially mistook for the end-of-day bell, Zito was just bringing his car up. When he opened the doors on the 8th floor, he was met not with passengers, but with a blast of heat and a wall of flame. Terrified women, their hair and clothes singed, poured into his car, screaming and clawing their way inside. He packed the car far beyond its capacity and made a terrifyingly slow descent. He would later testify, "I saw the flames." They were coming in through the door of the elevator. The girls were rushing out and jumping on me. They piled on top of me and on the car. Mortillaro, in the other passenger elevator, had a similar experience. He made 4 trips into the inferno. On his final trip up, he could see girls at the edge of the shaft, their clothes on fire, preparing to jump. He managed to pull some into his car, but the heat was now so intense that the elevator's runners began to warp in the shaft. On the way down, the weight of the overloaded car caused it to buckle, and it got stuck between floors. Mortillaro pried the doors open and helped his passengers crawl out to safety in the lobby. He and Zito saved dozens, perhaps over 100 lives. They kept going back up into the smoke until their machines would no longer run, until the heat made the shafts impassable. Thanks to their heroism and the fact that both stairways were accessible, the majority of workers on the 8th floor managed to escape. But as they stumbled out onto the street, choking and terrified, they looked up and saw a new horror unfolding 1 floor above them. On the 9th floor, the 260 workers, almost all of them women, had no idea what was happening below. The roar of their own machinery masked the sounds of the fire and the screams from the 8th floor. Their first warning was the sight of smoke seeping through the cracks in the floorboards. Then flames suddenly erupted outside the windows, climbing the building's facade with terrifying speed. Panic, delayed by a few crucial minutes, now exploded. Instinctively, a large group of women ran for the most direct exit, the stairway on the Washington Place side of the building. This was their main entrance and exit every day. They reached the door, a wave of desperate humanity, only to find it was locked. For a moment there must have been disbelief, then pure terror. They pushed, they screamed, they beat on the cold, unyielding metal with their bare hands. Behind them, the room was rapidly filling with smoke, the heat becoming unbearable. Yet the door wouldn't budge. The owner's policy, designed to prevent theft and keep union organizers out, had turned their workplace into a tomb. A manager who held the key was nowhere to be found. He had likely fled and locked the door out of habit, or simply to save himself. As the fire burst into the room from the stairwell and windows, the crowd at the locked door was consumed. Firefighters would later find them there, piled up against the exit, their bodies charred into an unrecognizable mass, a silent, horrific testament to their final futile moments. One survivor, Kate Alterman, later described the scene. The whole door was blocked by girls. They were hammering on the door. The fire was coming in on us. From the cutting room, we were trapped. Another group of workers, realizing the Washington Place door was impassable, turned and ran for the Green Street stairway at the other end of the room. But this route was also a death trap. The door opened inward, a critical design flaw, and the panicked rush of the crowd made it difficult to open against the press of bodies. When they finally managed to get it open, They were met with a blast of thick black smoke and intense heat billowing up from the 8th floor. The stairwell was a chimney. A few brave souls plunged into the darkness, holding onto each other and trying to feel their way down. Some made it. Many others stumbled, fell, and were trampled or overcome by the smoke. Their last hope was the fire escape. A crowd of about 70 people surged through the rear windows and onto the narrow metal structure. But it was a fire escape in name only. It was a flimsy, poorly constructed ladder, never intended for the weight of more than a few people. The iron slats were narrow, and the steps were steep. As more and more terrified workers poured onto it, the structure groaned under the strain. Then, with a sound like a gunshot, the bolts anchoring it to the brick wall ripped free. The entire fire escape twisted and collapsed, peeling away from the building like a ribbon. It sent more than 20 young women plunging nearly 100 feet into the brick-paved courtyard below, a place that would later be nicknamed the Killing Ground. The collapse of the fire escape sealed the fate of everyone left on the 9th floor. There was no way down. There was no way out. The only escape left was the sky. What happened next became the most infamous and enduring image of the Triangle Fire. Trapped on the 9th floor, with the fire roaring behind them and all exits blocked, the remaining workers were driven by the flames toward the windows. On the streets below, Green Street and Washington Place, crowds of pedestrians had gathered, drawn by the smoke and the sound of fire engines. They looked up in horror at what was unfolding. Silhouetted against the bright orange flames, the figures of young women began to appear on the window ledges, 90 feet above the pavement. For a moment they would pause, hesitating on the precipice between two unthinkable deaths. Some seemed to be praying. Some held onto the window frames until the heat forced them to let go. Then one by one, they jumped. William Gunn Shepard, a reporter for the United Press, was on the street and dictated his account live over a telephone, his voice trembling with shock. I looked up. The fire was roaring out of the windows, he reported. I learned a new sound that day, a sound I'll hear for the rest of my life, the sound of a body hitting the pavement. Thud dead, thud dead, thud dead. The crowd below watched, paralyzed with a sense of helpless horror. They screamed, "Don't jump!" But their cries were lost in the roar of the fire. The jumpers' skirts billowed out like parachutes, momentarily slowing their fall before they plunged to the sidewalk. Some jumped in pairs or even small groups, holding hands or clinging to one another for a final moment of human contact. A young man was seen helping 3 girls out onto the ledge, kissing each one gently before letting them drop. Then, after helping the last one, he calmly climbed onto the ledge and jumped himself. The fire department's life nets, the standard rescue equipment of the day, were useless. The force of a body falling from that height simply ripped the canvas from the hands of the firefighters holding it. In the space of less than 10 minutes, 58 people chose to leap to their deaths rather than be burned alive. One of the horrified onlookers was a 30-year-old social reformer named Frances Perkins. She was having tea in a nearby drawing room when she heard the fire engines. She ran to the scene and witnessed the final, terrible moments. The sight of those falling bodies would haunt her for the rest of her life, transforming her from a concerned academic into a relentless crusader for workers' rights. They were all girls, women in their summer shirtwaists, she would later recall. It was a terrible spectacle. We saw the fire, and we saw them jumping. The memory of it is so deep. The fire had found its most powerful witness. While their workers were being burned, suffocated, and smashed on the pavement, the Shirtwaist Kings, Max Blank, and Isaac Harris were making their own escape. They were on the 10th floor with about 70 other staff members when the warning call came up from the 8th floor. They acted quickly to save themselves and their office personnel. One group made it down the Green Street stairway before it became impassable. The owners, along with a number of others, including Blank's 2 young daughters who were visiting the factory that day, ran to the roof. From there, their escape was something out of an adventure story. Students from the adjacent New York University building, which was slightly taller, saw their plight. They managed to push a ladder across the 15-foot gap between the 2 buildings, creating a makeshift bridge. One by one, the people on the Ash Building roof, including Blank and Harris, crawled across the ladder to safety, just as the flames began to break through the roof behind them. They survived without a scratch. They would later claim they thought all their workers had already escaped. Down on the street, the scene was one of tragic futility. The New York Fire Department had responded with impressive speed, their horse-drawn engines thundering through the streets. But when they arrived, they were immediately faced with a fatal problem. Their extension ladders, the best technology they had, could only reach the 6th floor. They were a cruel 2 stories and 30 feet short of the trapped girls on the 9th floor. The firefighters could only stand there, pointing their hoses upwards, the streams of water falling uselessly back to the street, while the tragedy unfolded above their heads. They were brave men, willing to risk their lives, but they were defeated by a combination of inadequate technology and a building design that had prioritized profits over safety. The fireproof building had become a perfect oven, and they were powerless to stop it. By 5:15 p.m., less than 35 minutes after it began, the main fire was over. The inferno had consumed everything flammable, and then, with nothing left to burn, it had simply stopped. The sound of the roar was replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the hiss of water from the fire hoses and the groans of the injured. The building stood, a blackened skeleton against the evening sky. On the street below, a horrific tableau was laid bare, a sea of shattered bodies covered by tarps that did little to hide the reality of what had happened. The grim work of retrieving the dead and identifying the unidentifiable was about to begin. The fire was out, but the reckoning had just started. In less time than it takes for a lunch break, the fire had consumed everything and everyone it could reach. The sudden, unnatural silence that descended upon Washington Square was in many ways more horrifying than the chaos that preceded it. The building stood as a blackened tomb against the darkening sky, while the streets below had become a battlefield of the lost. The fire itself was over, but the true horror was just beginning to be understood. Now the story moves from the heat of the moment to the cold, grim reality of its consequences. It shifts from the collective terror of the victims to the individual, soul-crushing grief of the families who would now have to search for their loved ones among the dead, and to a city that was slowly awakening to the fact that it had just witnessed a preventable massacre. The fire itself lasted less than half an hour. The reckoning would last a lifetime. As the last embers died within the blackened shell of the Ash Building, a horrifying silence fell over Washington Square, broken only by the drip of water from fire hoses and the hushed, stunned voices of the crowd. The inferno had passed, but the true scope of the tragedy was only just beginning to reveal itself. On the sidewalks below, covered by grim tarps, lay the bodies of those who had jumped. Inside, amidst the charred debris and overturned sewing machines, were the remains of those who had been trapped. The city and the nation had witnessed something more than a deadly fire. They had witnessed a public execution, a mass death brought about not by a natural disaster, but by a man-made system of greed. The flames were out, but a new fire had been lit in the public conscience, a fire of grief, rage, and a relentless demand for justice that would forever change the relationship between labor and capital in America. In the hours and days that followed, New York City was submerged in a tidal wave of grief. The most immediate and agonizing task was the identification of the dead. The bodies were taken by police wagon to a makeshift morgue set up at the 26th Street Pier, a cavernous, gloomy structure normally used for charity services. Here, the 146 victims were laid out in rough wooden coffins, awaiting identification by their loved ones. For 4 days, a constant, heartbreaking procession of immigrant families filed through the pier. They were mothers, fathers, brothers, and husbands, their faces etched with a mixture of terror and desperate hope, searching for a daughter, a sister, a wife. The scene inside was a Dantean vision of sorrow. Many of the bodies were so badly burned or broken that they were unrecognizable. Identification often came down to a small personal detail that had somehow survived the horror: a fragment of a familiar dress, a worn shoe, a piece of jewelry, like a locket or a ring. One father, after searching for hours, finally identified his daughter only by the patched stocking she was wearing. Another recognized his son by the unique way his teeth had been filled. Day after day, the morgue was filled with the sounds of wrenching grief, the wails of mothers who had found their children, the silent, stunned shock of fathers who had lost everything. When a victim was identified, a bell would toll, a sound that echoed across the pier, each ring a fresh stab of pain for those still waiting, still searching. By the end of the week, 7 victims remained unidentified. Their families would never know their fate for certain, and their coffins were marked simply with a number. They became the fire's unknown soldiers. The city's grief quickly coalesced into a powerful, unified expression of anger. The labor unions and the Socialist Party, which had long been warning of the dangers of the sweatshops, organized a massive memorial procession. On April 5th, a cold and rainy Wednesday, the city came to a standstill. More than 120,000 people marched in a silent funeral parade down Fifth Avenue, the very street where the city's industrial titans lived in their opulent mansions. Another 300,000 New Yorkers lined the streets, standing shoulder to shoulder in the drenching rain, their heads bowed in respect and solidarity. It was a stunning public rebuke of the Gilded Age system. Rich and poor, immigrant and native-born, Jew, Catholic, and Protestant. The entire city seemed to march as one. The silence of the crowd was its most powerful feature. It was a quiet, dignified roar of outrage, a collective promise that the 146 victims would not be forgotten. One banner, carried by a group of garment workers, summed up the mood of the city: "We demand justice." The sight of hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers marching in the pouring rain was more than a tribute. It was a powerful public accusation. The silent process points out a collective finger not just at a flawed system, but at the 2 men who sat at its pinnacle. Grief, however profound, was not enough. The city's sorrow quickly hardened into a demand for legal accountability. The names of Max Blank and Isaac Harris, once symbols of immigrant success, are now synonymous with criminal negligence. The battle will now move from the streets to the courtroom, as the people of New York sought to prove that the locked door was not just a safety violation, but a weapon, and that the Shirtwaist Kings were guilty of nothing less than manslaughter. The public's demand for justice was directed squarely at 2 men, the Shirtwaist Kings, Max Blank and Isaac Harris. Just weeks after the fire, a grand jury indicted them on 7 counts of manslaughter, with the prosecution focusing on the deaths of 2 specific victims, Margaret Schwartz and Dora Evans. The trial, which began in December 1911, became a national sensation, a dramatic courtroom battle that pitted the wealthy, powerful factory owners against their poor immigrant workers. It was seen as a trial not just of two men, but of an entire system. On the surface, the case against them seemed overwhelming. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Charles S. Bostwick, presented over 150 witnesses. One after another, young survivors took the stand and told their harrowing stories. The most crucial testimony came from those who had worked on the 9th floor. In halting English, translated from Yiddish and Italian, they described the locked door on the Washington Place site. Kate Alterman, a 24-year-old survivor, gave a particularly emotional account. She testified that just before the fire, she had tried the door and found it locked. When the fire broke out, she saw Margaret Schwartz, one of the victims named in the indictment, at the door. She was screaming, "The door's locked! The door's locked!" Alterman recalled, her voice breaking. She was trying to open it. She was pushing and pulling on the knob. There was a big crowd, and the flames were coming in. I saw the flames on her. The defense, led by cunning attorney Max D. Steuer, did not deny the fire, but focused on destroying the survivors' credibility. He exploited the jury's prejudice against poor female immigrant workers, portraying them as unreliable and possibly coaxed into testifying. His key argument was that there was no evidence that the two owners, Blank and Harris, knew the door was locked at the time the fire broke out, thereby creating a reasonable doubt. The strategy worked. After less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found the two owners not guilty, much to the shock and pain of the victims' families. Although they later paid $75 per life in a civil lawsuit, Blanc and Harris received more than $60,000 in insurance, meaning they had profited more than $400 for each of their dead workers. This judgment brutally shows that the wealth of the rich is valued more than the lives of the poor. The jury's verdict of not guilty was a legal victory for Max Blank and Isaac Harris, but it was a profound moral defeat for the justice system. The acquittals send a shockwave through the city, confirming the deepest fears of the working poor, that in a contest between wealth and human life, wealth will always win in a court of law. Yet this final bitter injustice became the very catalyst for the fire's most enduring legacy. If the law as it exists was unable to deliver justice, then the law itself would have to be remade. The public outrage, which could find no release in the courtroom, was channeled into an unstoppable political movement, transforming the tragedy from a story of loss into a powerful engine of reform that would redefine the meaning of progress in America for generations to come. The acquittal of Blank and Harris could have been the final bitter chapter in the story. Instead, it was the beginning of a new one. The public outrage over the verdict was so immense and so sustained that it could not be ignored by the political establishment. If the courts would not provide justice, then the legislature would have to provide protection. A group of progressive reformers, labor leaders, and politicians seized the moment, determined to ensure that a tragedy like the Triangle Fire would never happen again. Their efforts led to the creation of the New York State Factory Investigating Commission in June 1911. This was no mere fact-finding committee. It was one of the most powerful and wide-ranging legislative investigations in American history. At its head were two ambitious young politicians from the Tammany Hall machine, Assemblyman Alfred E. Smith, a gruff cigar-chomping product of the Lower East Side, and State Senator Robert F. Wagner, a thoughtful German immigrant. They were an unlikely pair of reformers, but the fire had profoundly affected them both. The driving force behind the commission's day-to-day work was the witness who had seen the girls jump, Frances Perkins. Along with other reformers, she guided Smith, Wagner, and the other commissioners on a series of tours through the state's factories, canneries, and tenement workshops. For the first time, these powerful politicians came face to face with the brutal reality of industrial labor. They saw children as young as 5 years old working in dangerous conditions. They saw factories with no ventilation, no sanitation, and doors that were chained shut. They descended into mines and climbed the stairs of filthy tenements. Al Smith would later say, "I had seen a fire, and I had seen 146 people killed, but I had never seen the conditions that made that fire possible. That was what the commission showed me." Over the next 4 years, the commission held 59 public hearings, took testimony from nearly 500 witnesses, and produced a 13-volume report that meticulously documented the systemic failures of industrial capitalism. Their work resulted in an unprecedented wave of reform. The New York State Legislature passed 36 new laws that would become a model for the entire nation. These laws mandated automatic fire sprinklers in high-rise buildings. They required that factory doors swing outward and remain unlocked during the working hours. They established strict regulations for fire escapes, fire drills, and factory sanitation. They created the first state-level fire marshal's office. Crucially, they also went beyond fire safety, passing laws to limit the work week for women and children, to prohibit children under 14 from working in factories, and to expand the regulatory power of the state's Department of Labor. It was the most ambitious package of labor protection laws ever passed by a state in American history. The legacy of the Triangle Fire and the Factory Investigating Commission extended far beyond the borders of New York. The fire became a foundational event for the American progressive movement, a stark and undeniable symbol of the human cost of unregulated industry. The lessons learned in its aftermath shaped the course of American politics for the next half-century. The two politicians who led the commission, Al Smith and Robert Wagner, went on to have towering national careers. Smith became a 4-term governor of New York, where he continued to champion progressive reforms. Wagner was elected to the U.S. Senate, where he became one of the key architects of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, the landmark pieces of federal legislation that created the modern American social safety net, the National Labor Relations Act, often called the Wagner Act, which guaranteed workers the right to unionize, the Social Security Act, and the Fair Labor Standards Act, which established the national minimum wage, and the 40-hour work week, all had their conceptual roots in the work of the commission that rose from the ashes of the Triangle Factory. And Frances Perkins, the horrified witness, became the first woman ever to serve in a U.S. presidential cabinet. As FDR's Secretary of Labor from 1933 to 1945, she was the driving force behind much of the New Deal's labor and social legislation. She never forgot the sight of the girls jumping from the windows. She once said that the New Deal began on March 25, 1911. For her, the memory of the fire was a sacred obligation, a debt owed to the dead that could only be repaid by building a more just and humane society. Today, the Ash Building still stands, now a part of New York University and a National Historic Landmark. For many years, the only commemoration was a simple plaque, but the memory of the fire has been kept alive by generations of labor activists, historians, and the descendants of the victims. The fire serves as a permanent, powerful reminder of why we have workplace safety laws, why we have unions, and why we have government regulations. It is a lesson written in blood and smoke that a society's progress must be measured not just by its technological marvels and its economic output, but by its commitment to protecting the dignity and the lives of its working people. The 146 souls lost that day were not just victims. They were martyrs whose sacrifice ignited a movement and reshaped a nation. Their final, desperate cries from the windows of the 9th floor became a call to action that continues to echo to this day.